Elara was a widow. This was the first and most important fact of her life in the small town of Silver Creek. She lived in a cabin her husband Elias had built with his own hands. It stood apart from the town, where the gravel of the main road gave way to a dirt track that wound down to the riverbank. Her only other possessions of note were a sway-backed horse named Shale and a small collection of leather-bound journals. The journals had also belonged to Elias, and his father before him, and his father before him. They were a record of the river. Page after page, written in a cramped, steady hand, detailed the movements of the water, the patterns of the fish, the habits of the birds, the character of the wind on any given day. Elias had read them to her in the long evenings, his voice a low rumble against the crackle of the fire. He had taught her to see the world as his family had seen it, not as a thing to be conquered, but as a story to be read. Elias had been gone for 5 years now, taken by a summer fever that had swept through the valley with no regard for his strength or his knowledge. But the journals remained. In the spring of that year, Elara had read a passage she had never seen before, tucked into the very last pages of the oldest volume. It was an entry from her husband's great-grandfather. It spoke of a long cold, a winter that did not just visit, but came to stay, a winter that could freeze the great river solid to its muddy bottom, a winter that arrived once in a man's lifetime, if he was unlucky. The entry was dated 78 years prior. The journals spoke of signs in the behavior of the squirrels, in the early departure of the geese, in the color of the moss on the north side of the oaks. That spring and summer, Elara saw the signs, all of them. So she began her project. The journals described a method of preservation, a way to cure the river fish so they would last through a winter of impossible length. It required a special kind of shed, built of dry stacked stone. It required green alder wood for the smoke. It required a precise amount of salt, harvested from the river flats during the lowest tides of summer. And it required fish. Hundreds of pounds of fish. She went to see Mayor Thompson in August. It was not for permission. It was a courtesy. A quiet warning she knew he would not heed. His office was in the new brick town hall, a proud building with tall windows that looked down on the orderly street. He sat behind a large oak desk, his hands folded over a stack of official-looking papers. 500 pounds of cured fish, he asked, a smile playing on his lips. Elara, what on earth for? For the winter, she said simply. A hard winter is coming. The mayor leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. We have the railway, he said, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. The train brings supplies twice a week, regular as clockwork. We have Mister Abernathy's new smokehouse, the finest in the county. We are a civilized town now, Elara. We don't need to hoard food like squirrels. He patted her hand. You leave the worrying to us men, he finished, his tone thick with condescension. Elara left without another word. The story of her visit spread through Silver Creek like a grass fire. Elara and her 500 pounds of fish. It became the joke of the season. Mister Abernathy, the town's wealthiest merchant, found it particularly amusing. He was in the process of constructing a new, modern smokehouse near the rail depot. It was a marvel of engineering, with a tall brick chimney, a steam-powered fan system, and space to process 1,000 pounds of meat and fish a week. He stood before his half-finished monument to progress, gesturing toward the river where Elara was rumored to be building her primitive shed. Dry stacked stone? He boomed to the men gathered at the general store. No mortar. The first good wind will take it down. She'll be burying herself in that pile of rocks. The men laughed. The project was given a name: Elara's Folly. The ridicule grew sharper when Dr. Finch became involved. He was a young man, educated back east, full of new ideas about hygiene and modern medicine. He heard about Elara's methods from the gossiping women at the mercantile. Green alder wood, river salt, a stone shed with a dirt floor. He was horrified. He cornered a group of men outside the church one Sunday. "This is madness," he declared, his voice ringing with scientific authority. "Her methods are unsanitary, uncontrolled smoking, impure salt. It's a perfect recipe for botulism, for poison." The word stuck. Elara's poison. Children would see her walking along the riverbank and chant the name. The townspeople took up the joke with cruel enthusiasm. If a man made a foolish decision at the saloon, his friends would say he was salting his own grave, and everyone would know what it meant. The insult was a reference to Elara. The town of Silver Creek, in its collective wisdom, had decided she was a fool, a mad widow engaged in a suicidal folly. Elara heard the whispers. She saw the pointed fingers and the smirks. It did not matter. The journals knew. The river knew. And Elara knew. So she worked. Her labor began at dawn and ended at dusk, a rhythm set by the sun, not the town clock. Shale, her old horse, was her only companion. Together they hauled stones from the riverbed. Each stone was chosen with care, for its weight, its shape, its flatness. She worked with a quiet, methodical intensity that baffled those who watched from a distance. She lifted stones a man would struggle with, using leverage and patience, her movements economical and precise. She stacked them, one on top of the other, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle. There was no mortar. The weight of the stones held the walls together, a technique from the journals that allowed the structure to settle and shift with the frozen ground, rather than crack. It was brutal work. Her hands became calloused and raw. Her back ached with a fire that never quite went out. But the walls rose, slow and steady, a silent testament to her resolve. She designed the ventilation flues herself, narrow channels within the thick stone walls, calculated to draw the smoke evenly over the hanging racks without letting the heat escape. One flue for intake, low on the north wall, another for exhaust, high on the south wall. It was a system of perfect, passive circulation. While the town admired Mr. Abernathy's steam-powered fans, Elara was building a machine that ran on the laws of physics alone. Next came the wood. She and Shale ventured deep into the forests that lined the valley. The journals were specific. It had to be green alder, not oak, not pine, not maple. Alder produced a cool, dense smoke, low in tar, that cured the fish without cooking it. She spent weeks felling the trees, bucking the logs, and hauling them back to her small plot of land. The woodpile grew into a small mountain, a fortress of fuel. She calculated the cords of wood needed. She calculated the burn rate. She had enough to keep a slow, constant smoke for 8 weeks. Then came the salt. During the last week of August, when the sun was at its hottest and the river at its lowest, she walked the exposed salt flats downstream. She gathered the crusty, mineral-rich salt with a small trowel, scraping it into canvas sacks. It was not the pure, white, refined salt sold at the general store. It was grey and coarse, full of trace minerals that the journals claimed were essential for the curing process. Dr. Finch would have called it filth. Elara called it life. Finally, in late September, the autumn fish run began. The river turned silver with the bodies of migrating trout and salmon. Elara worked her nets from a small, flat-bottomed boat Elias had built. She worked day and night, pulling in catch after catch. The townspeople saw the growing piles of fish on her cleaning table and shook their heads in pity and disgust. "Such a waste," they murmured. "All that good fish turned to poison." She did not waste a single one. She cleaned them with a practiced hand, her knife a blur of silver. She brined them in wooden barrels, using a precise ratio of river salt to fresh water. Then she began to hang them. Row after row of glistening fish suspended from wooden racks inside the cool, dark stone of her newly finished shed. 520 pounds, all told. On the 1st of October, she lit the fire. A wisp of cool, fragrant alder smoke drifted from the high flue, a quiet signal that the final stage of her work had begun. For the next 2 months, she tended the fire, never letting it get too hot, never letting it go out. Her life became a cycle of gathering wood, checking the smoke, and sleeping in short bursts. She was a solitary priestess tending a sacred flame. As the days grew shorter and the air grew colder, she began to see the final signs. The signs the journals had warned of. The squirrels in the woods behind her cabin moved with a manic, desperate energy. They stripped the pine trees bare, hoarding cones in burrows dug deep into the earth. They were not preparing for winter. They were preparing for war. The river birds, the hardy loons and mergansers that usually stayed until the first ice, were gone. They had vanished in a single day, a mass exodus in mid-October, a full month ahead of schedule. The river fell silent. An unnatural quiet settled over the valley. The air itself changed. It became thin and sharp, carrying a strange, metallic scent, like cold steel. On the morning of November 17th, Elara checked the old barometer that hung on her cabin wall. The needle had fallen so far, so fast, that she thought the instrument was broken. It pointed to a pressure lower than any recorded in the journals. A storm was not coming. A siege was coming. She stood on her porch for a long time, looking toward the distant lights of Silver Creek. The town was oblivious. They were planning their Thanksgiving celebrations. Mr. Abernathy was putting the final touches on his grand smokehouse. Dr. Finch was preparing a lecture on the dangers of folk remedies. She considered walking into town one last time. She considered shouting a warning in the street, but she saw their faces in her mind. The mayor's condescending smile, Abernathy's booming laugh, Finch's look of clinical disdain. They would not listen. They would call her the mad widow, the prophet of poison. Her warning would only be met with more ridicule. So she turned away. She spent the rest of the day in calm, meticulous preparation. She brought Shale into the reinforced lean-to beside the cabin, giving him extra hay and water. She stacked a month's worth of firewood inside, next to her hearth. She checked the seal on her cabin door and packed the cracks with moss and clay. Her last act was to visit the stone shed. The air inside was cool and heavy with the scent of alder smoke and cured fish. She sealed the final vent with a carefully shaped stone and a plug of clay. The work was done. Elara's folly was ready. It began at 4 o'clock in the morning on November 18th. It did not begin with a gentle flurry. It arrived as a physical blow. A wall of wind and snow slammed into the valley, a thing of mythic violence. The sound was not a howl, it was a solid, grinding roar that vibrated deep in the chest. The snow was not flakes, it was a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice and powder. Within an hour, the world outside Elara's window vanished. There was no river, no trees, no sky, only a roiling, suffocating whiteness. In the town of Silver Creek, the failure of the conventional began almost immediately. The first thing to go was Mister Abernathy's proud, modern smokehouse. Its tall, elegant brick chimney acted like a sail in the wind. It snapped at its base with a sound like a cannon shot, collapsing onto the roof below. The weight of the snow, accumulating at a rate of a foot an hour, did the rest. The brand-new roof of Abernathy's Folly splintered and collapsed, burying his modern dream under a tomb of snow and brick. Next, the power lines. The town's connection to the modern world snapped under the weight of the ice. The town was plunged into darkness. The roof of the general store, with its wide, unsupported span, groaned for an hour before giving way with a deafening crack, burying the town's central supply of food. Windows on the windward side of town shattered from the relentless pressure of the wind, letting the blizzard directly into people's homes. The systems of civilization, so praised by Mayor Thompson, were being dismantled one by one. The train had not arrived. The train would not be arriving. Miles down the track, the locomotive and its cars were already buried under a 20-foot drift, a frozen metal serpent in a sea of white. The river, the town's timeless source of water and winter fishing, was undergoing a terrifying transformation. The savage cold was freezing it at an impossible rate. Ice was not just forming on the surface. It was locking the entire body of water into a solid, unmoving block. The river was dying. Inside her small cabin, Elara was safe. The structure, built low to the ground and sheltered by a stand of old-growth pine, was anchored to the earth. The wind roared over its sod roof, but inside, the sound was a distant, muffled hum. Snow piled up against the walls, not as an enemy, but as an ally. The drifts became a layer of perfect insulation, sealing her in, holding the precious warmth of her small fire. The internal temperature of the cabin remained stable. She had water from a small, deep well Elias had dug inside the attached lean-to. She had fuel. She had food. She sat by her fire, listening to the storm, and felt no fear. She was not surviving. She was simply living. One day bled into the next. The storm raged for 4 days without pause. When it finally stopped, the silence was as shocking as the noise had been. The world was buried. The snow was 20 feet deep in the valley, piled into monstrous drifts that reshaped the landscape. The tops of the tallest trees were barely visible. The town of Silver Creek was gone, erased from sight. Only the occasional peak of a roof or the top of a chimney hinted at the community entombed below. For the people of the town, the true ordeal had just begun. They were trapped in their homes, their food supplies dwindling, their firewood running low. The cold was a relentless, living thing. It seeped through the walls, cracked the plaster, and coated every surface with a layer of frost. The initial shock gave way to a gnawing, desperate hunger. After 10 days, the first person came to Elara's door. He had spent 6 hours tunneling from his house, following the memory of the riverbank. It was Dr. Finch. He looked like a ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with a fear that had burned away all his arrogance. His fine wool coat was torn, his hands wrapped in bloody rags. He collapsed on her doorstep when she opened it. Elara dragged him inside, to the warmth of the fire. She gave him a mug of hot water. He drank it greedily, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the cup. "My children," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We have no food. Nothing left." He could not meet her eyes. Section. He was the man who had warned the town about her poison. Now he was begging for it. Elara said nothing. She did not offer a word of reproach, not a single, "I told you so." Such things were a luxury for a world that no longer existed. She simply went to the small pantry where she kept her personal supply of the cured fish. She sliced off a thick slab and handed it to him, along with a piece of hard bread. The doctor stared at the dark, smoky flesh of the fish. Elara's poison. He began to weep, great, silent tears rolling down his frostbitten cheeks. He ate it like a starving animal. When he was done, she wrapped up a larger piece for his family. "Tell them to eat it slowly," was all she said. He left as he had come, a humbled man, disappearing into a tunnel of snow. He was the first, but he was not the last. The news of Elara's survival, of her warmth, of her food, spread through the buried town like a rumor of a miracle. A procession of the humbled began. They came in ones and twos, families digging their way from house to house, creating a network of tunnels that all led to the widow's cabin by the river. She took them all in. Her small home became a refuge, crowded with the very people who had scorned her. She organized them, rationing the food and water with a quiet authority that no one questioned. She became their leader. The cured fish from the stone shed, once a symbol of her folly, was now their salvation. It was their Eucharist. They ate it with a reverence born of desperation, and its rich, salty taste was the taste of life itself. The last to arrive, 2 weeks into the siege, were Mayor Thompson and Mister Abernathy. They were broken men. Abernathy had lost his fortune, his new smokehouse a pile of rubble. Thompson had watched his town, his proud, civilized town, starve. They stood before her, their heads bowed, their faces etched with shame. "Elara," the mayor began, his voice hoarse. "We—" He could not finish. Words had failed him. Elara simply nodded and handed them each a piece of the fish. She fed her mockers, just as she had fed everyone else. In her sanctuary, there was no room for pride or punishment. There was only survival. The long cold lasted for 3 months. When the thaw finally came in late March, it was slow and agonizing. The town that emerged from the snow was scarred and changed forever. As soon as the roads were clear enough to gather, a town meeting was called. It was not held in the damaged town hall. It was held in the open air, in the muddy space before Elara's cabin. The entire surviving population of Silver Creek was there. Mayor Thompson, Dr. Finch, and Mister Abernathy stood before them. They did not stand as leaders. They stood as penitents. Mayor Thompson spoke first, his voice clear and steady in the cold spring air. "I have been your mayor for 10 years, he began. "In that time, I have spoken of progress. I have spoken of civilization. I have spoken of the railway, of new buildings, of modern ways." He paused, and his eyes found Elara, who stood quietly by her doorway. "I was a fool," he said, the words sharp and clean. "We were all fools. We were blinded by our own noise, proud of our own clocks. We forgot how to listen." He gestured to Elara. She listened. She listened to the quiet things, to the river, to the trees, to the wisdom of those who came before. She tried to warn us, and we laughed at her. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople. She was right. We were wrong. There are no other words for it. Dr. Finch stepped forward next. "I called her knowledge poison," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My education, my books, my science, they taught me nothing of value.
That fish, which I named Poison, was the only thing that kept my children alive. Her wisdom was the only medicine that mattered. Finally, Mister Abernathy, a man reduced to the clothes on his back, spoke. I built a monument to my own pride, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the ruins of his smokehouse. It was loud and new and worthless. She built a shelter of quiet strength. It endured. It saved us. When they were finished, a silence fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to Elara. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable. She did not speak of forgiveness. She did not speak of their mockery. Pride does not fill an empty stomach, she said, her voice calm and even. Progress does not keep you warm when the fire goes out. Survival is not about what is new.
It is about what is true. She looked from face to face. The knowledge is here, she said, tapping her temple. It is in the journals. It is in the river. If you are willing to learn, I am willing to teach. And so, the transformation of Silver Creek began. They rebuilt their town, but they rebuilt it differently. They built low to the ground. They insulated their homes with sod and earth, and on every property, next to every home, they built a stone shed. They learned from Elara the art of dry stacking stone. They learned to read the signs in nature. They learned the old ways of curing and preserving, using green alder and river salt. The phrase that had once been an insult was reborn. To do an Elara no longer meant to engage in a foolish act. It came to mean preparing with uncommon foresight, acting with quiet wisdom, and listening to the world instead of just yourself. Elara lived for another 30 years. She never remarried. She never had children of her own. She remained in her small cabin by the river, a solitary figure who held the collective memory of the town. She never fully rejoined the community, never sat on their councils or attended their socials, but she was their center. She was their teacher, their sage, the quiet conscience of a town that had learned its lesson at the cost of everything it valued. She taught their children how to read the journals, how to understand the language of the river, how to know the difference between the silence of peace and the silence of warning. She died peacefully in her sleep one autumn night, with the sound of the river flowing just outside her window. The entire town mourned her passing. They buried her on the small hill beside Elias, overlooking the water that had been the source of all their knowledge. The day after her funeral, the town council commissioned a plaque. It was cast in solid bronze. They did not place it in the town square or on the new town hall. They affixed it to the heavy wooden door of the original stone shed, which they maintained as a historic landmark. The inscription was simple, taken from the eulogy given by the son of Dr. Finch, who was now the town's new doctor. It read, "She listened when the world was silent. In her wisdom, we survived."